Um, Great. I'm going to talk tonight about medical debt. And this is a topic that is part of my professional life. I've written about the affordability of cancer care in academic work. And in my day job, I run a medical billing company here in South Bend, Indiana. So for anyone who's local, we work with South Bend Orthopedics, Allied Physician Surgery Center, and Unity Physicians Hospital. So in a way, I feel like part of the problem here. But since I'm in among the machinery of medical billing and healthcare finance, I hope I can bring that perspective to this work and help all of you understand a little bit better this evening what medical debt is, why it's getting worse. I'd love to hear a little bit from anyone who would like to share about experiences that you or loved ones have had with medical debt, and we can spend a little bit of time understanding that perspective before we talk about different ways that anyone who's interested in this side of debt in our society today can help those around us and help ourselves, since this is really a major issue, not only in the United States, but as we'll see in other countries as well. So I'm going to share some slides from my computer and give a short lecture on some of the basics of what I've talked about here. And I'd love to take any questions that you have along the way. Just give me 1 second here. So let's start with, what is it we're talking about here? What is medical debt? And I've proposed a definition here that is quite broad, but I think fair to the experience of people who interact with the healthcare system in America, saying that medical debt is money that's owed to a healthcare provider. That could be a hospital, a doctor's office, any other kind of healthcare provider, for care and related debt. And we'll talk about what related debt might be, but it certainly starts with medical bills and then broadens from there. And some examples of different kinds of medical debt that I wanted to segment out here and help make our broader definition a little bit more concrete are, on the left-hand side, some of the medical bill related debt, and on the right-hand side, some of the other things that go along with the bills themselves. So certainly uninsured patients who end up on the hook for the full bill, that often leads to medical debt, but also patients with insurance and the portions that are not covered. Even a portion of a very large bill can leave a very large balance as well. There's something called surprise bills, number 3 here, that's recently been in the news because there was some legislation to try to reduce them. And those often happen when there's a mistake with insurance, when there's an error, or if you end up at an out-of-network provider, which can be hard to avoid. And then if we think about, on the right-hand side, some of the broader effects as well, even if the bill gets paid from the provider's perspective, or if you no longer owe the hospital money, you may well owe other people money. You may have just put the bill on a credit card, which is then, of course, incurring interest charges. The bill may have been sent to a collections agency, or there are increasingly companies that will provide you with new sources of debt, loan you money to be able to get the care that you need, and now you owe them money as well. So it's not just owing money to the hospital. And it's not just health-related expenses, strictly speaking, either. I think folks will probably be familiar with the website GoFundMe, which helps people raise money for whatever cause they want. The most common use of GoFundMe is to pay medical bills, and many of those campaigns are unsuccessful. But one thing that the leader of GoFundMe mentioned that I found particularly upsetting, really, is that even in countries with free healthcare, so there are no medical bills, crowdfunding is still an important source of income for people who are sick because of all of the other expenses that go along with health conditions, things like lost wages, transportation, hotel bills, and of course, here in the US, all of those are true as well. So this all adds up to a really large problem of medical debt that has certainly financial impacts, just like any other source of debt, incurring interest so that the cost grows over time, the kind of sacrifices of other needed spending that go toward medical bills instead, draining savings in retirement, ending up in the court system, and going through bankruptcy as a result, as well as the impact on communities and families across generations, and throughout areas of the country where people have banded together, kind of the flip side of the crowdfunding model. But then also, of course, lots of non-financial impacts, the psychological impact of having a bill on the kitchen counter, as it's often referred, harassment from people trying to collect. There's certainly a healthcare specific angle of not wanting to go back to the same provider or any provider for fear of future medical debts, or even being specifically prevented from accessing further care because of an outstanding balance, as well as that history showing up on credit reporting, and just the time associated with healthcare and medical bills is a big part of everyone's life, but even more so if you have got a payment plan or a balance to address. So this to me is what medical debt is, and some of the different ways that it goes beyond just simple medical bills. I'll pause here. Would love to hear any reactions or questions, or if there's anyone on the call with personal experience with medical debt that raises issues you'd like to contribute. I'd love to hear those now. And if no one wants to share, that's perfectly fine too. Mary, I saw your hand.
Okay, well, my husband and I are presently in a situation where he had an unexpected medical emergency, and the bills, the initial bills from the hospital were so extreme, I couldn't believe it, like $80,000 for one procedure or something. Fortunately, I do have insurance, and the insurance has something called out-of-pocket maximum. Well, we've already reached our out-of-pocket maximum, and we have a payment plan to pay that off. But if people didn't have that, it's incredible the amount that you could be billed for one procedure.
Very well said. And even though, like you said, you have insurance, you might have had a very large bill if you hadn't hit your out-of-pocket maximum, and if you hadn't had an out-of-pocket maximum on the plan, that could have been an extraordinarily large bill. So I'm sorry to hear that, but I appreciate you sharing, because I think it shows how, even people who end up in an okay situation have to go through an experience of confronting what that bill could do to you if things were just a little bit different.
Not so much a question, but just a reaction. This makes me think of not a personal experience because I haven't lived it, but my brother and the place that my wife works at with having children and
Mm.
being uninsured and just how expensive that could be. I just never realized how yeah how costly it is and how that impacts you're talking about families here, how that impacts people's families, and the choices that they have in terms of whether or not to have children, and when and how. So that's why people say babies are so expensive. But I don't think
It
it's
starts at the very beginning, right?
the baby's fault, but it's our system's fault, right? That put people in these positions where they have to choose between, money and bearing life and growing a family.
It absolutely is our system's fault, and it really does disrupt families at a crucial moment where you are about to incur these other expenses of feeding another person, of diapers, of doctor's visits, and getting off on a rough foot. And the mystery of it all is really frustrating too. Even people who are prepared for this, knowing they should ask the hospital how much it's going to be, get an answer like, well, we could never say, maybe it'll be a C-section, in which case it'll be so much different, which brings up a related issue of transparency in terms of what the cost of the procedure is. That's just really hard to come by and makes everything worse. So thank you for bringing that up.
Two related thoughts. The first would just be the kind of the downside of insurance, which is, I was going on for like telehealth visit that was, recommended to me through a provider that was recommended through my insurance. And it was about a 3-minute call for a problem that I already knew how to diagnose, had it before, knew what the proper thing to prescribe was. So basically told the doctor, I have this and I need this. It was often just a minute. And, I saw on the website that it would cost me $30 for this telehealth visit. I was like, okay, that's worth it. And then, but because I had provided my insurance, it was going to cost me $350 for this 3-minute visit. And so then I said, oh, can I take the insurance off now? Like they said, no, we're legally obligated to, put this through your insurance because we know you have the insurance because you gave it to us. And I was like, I wouldn't have given it to you if I had known this was going to happen. But then, on the other side of things, from our community perspective, I just want to say I really appreciated how you've included those other types of medical debt, including credit cards, because a lot of us know the story. One of our first loans through this community at Simone Bay House was for an older man who used a high interest credit card to pay off medical debt because he kept getting these alerts in the mail, saying, you owe this much, you owe this much. Thought, oh, I need to pay this off, and then all of a sudden was buried in credit card debt because of this high interest credit card, which we were able to refinance as a community for 0% interest. Just an example of the way what we're doing here can kind of dovetail, at least on that side of things. It's not kind of upstream to the actual provider, at least for the credit card debt that might come from medical emergencies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, medical debt is not the largest source of debt in the country. Student loan debt is higher, mortgage debt is higher, but there's a category of consumer debt, which is what ends up on credit cards more or less, and it is the leading cause of consumer debt that then often multiplies over time. And I think the connection you're drawing with the Communion Economy Initiative and the opportunity to make zero interest loans, medical debt may be a great target for that kind of work and a way to start a conversation as well about the sorts of debt that the community is interested in helping alleviate. So I have a video here that we'll send around the link for, and I recommend just to hear kind of another story about how medical debt can can upend a family. And, I think we've already drawn out a lot of the themes from our discussion and from what I've said, but I'd just add a little tidbit from this video is people who are entrepreneurs, who are part of a small business, who are at more financial risk for hospital bills because of their insurance situation. The ripple effects that can have on a community, including losing their entire business, which was a target of legal action. There's just really a lot at stake when it comes to medical debt for everyone. And this is a good example in the video, but we will skip through it now. Hang on. There we go. We talked a little bit about the scale of the issue in terms of how much medical debt is out there. As I mentioned, a common comparison that's made is between medical debt and student loan debt, which has been in the news a fair amount recently. The estimate for the total amount of medical debt is between 195 billion on the low end and something like $500 billion. That's about half to a third of the total student loan debt held in the US, which is estimated at 1.5 trillion. But I think it's powerful to take a look at how that's distributed and how that impacts different demographic groups and communities in the US, because for the most part, not always, but for the most part, holders of student loan debt have advanced degrees as a result of that. But here you see a disproportionate burden of medical debt falling to women, Black adults, people in middle age, often before they've had the chance to accumulate wealth, especially if they're starting out with an intergenerational wealth gap, which is often associated with race. People who are uninsured, who have lower incomes, with disabilities, with worse health status, living in rural areas, and in states either in the South or who have not chosen to expand Medicaid, which is a policy choice that some states have made recently since Obamacare and some haven't. And anyone who falls in one or more of those categories is more likely to have medical debt alongside certainly other challenges. There are links here with other estimates of the higher medical debt. We don't have to go too deep into the causes here of the dysfunction of our healthcare system, because I think it's apparent from some of the discussion we've had so far. But just briefly, from where I sit about why medical debt is bad and getting worse, the first thing that you have to take a look at is the increase in prices for healthcare services. So just like Mary, you were mentioning, having a sticker price of $80,000 for a procedure, or for people who have extended hospital stays or complex surgeries like transplants, can easily go above $1 million. Not only were those prices high to begin with, but they get much higher every year. The rate of healthcare inflation is outmatched only by textbooks, college tuition, and childcare, as you can see from this chart. Whereas, even housing is about average in terms of overall inflation. And in the inflationary environment that we're, in at the moment, at least, this situation could certainly get worse. But there's some other things going on too. Oftentimes, employers or people who sponsor insurance plans end up with a pretty large bill for healthcare services. And so they try to, make their benefits cheaper for them, and making plans worse for patients. So you end up with higher deductibles, higher coinsurance, higher out-of-pocket maximums, the sorts of things that end up with patients having the bill rather than the insurance company, which could be the employer indirectly. And healthcare providers, although they certainly deserve their share of the blame, especially for some of the more aggressive collection practices, that they've been pursuing recently have also been squeezed. And so they're looking to stay afloat by going after every dollar they can. So whereas in the past, some of these might have been written off, less so today. And then alongside that, there's certainly a large number of uninsured people still in the US. And the complexity of private health insurance, as Emma was mentioning, is leading to more errors and more situations where it's actually not to your advantage to use your insurance. But the last point I'll make here before we kind of transition to some good news and some things that we can do is that oftentimes patients haven't been educated, haven't had the resources to fight back. We're not taught in school how to navigate the healthcare system, and especially if you're younger and don't use it very often, or if you're older and things have changed since the last time you were at the provider, there's certainly a lot of challenges in navigating that. So it's good that not only are things getting worse, but they're also getting better in some ways. And I think this is just a start. But in the last 3 months, there's been more attention to this issue on the national stage. Credit agencies have started excluding most medical debt from credit reports. And the reason is not because they're great people, although they may well be. Their job is to calculate credit worthiness, or the likelihood that someone can pay back a loan. And what they found was so many people have medical debt, and says so little about your credit worthiness that they may as well not count it at all. And so that's how it's ended up out of credit reports for the vast majority of people. The current administration, as well as the prior administration, have taken some positive executive order and legislative steps to try to limit these aggressive collection practices, as well as the No Surprise Billing Act, which tackles some of those surprise bills I mentioned earlier, number 3, as well as incentivizing states to make laws for requiring hospitals to provide transparency in terms of their pricing, which is still very uneven and only applies to hospitals. So this problem won't be fixed overnight, and it won't be fixed only through top-down action, although I think there is an important place for policy and politics and all this. So for the remainder of the time, I want to highlight 3 grassroots organizations that are supporting the abolishment of medical debt and who kind of welcome involvement from others. Before I go into those, any additional questions or reflections on kind of the state of things and dynamics, both good and bad? All right.
I guess actually I have one question.
Go ahead.
When you talk about more aggressive collection practices on the part of hospitals, can you just say more of what you mean by that? Like what that looks like?
Yeah.
And also who's making those decisions within the hospital system?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it does vary considerably from institution to institution and depending on how their financial status is at the given time. I have worked with healthcare providers who say it's the right thing to do is to let people pay who we're going to pay, ask people politely once to see if they forgot, and then be done with it. So that's, one end of the spectrum. And usually for people who are, less worried about money in their practice. On the other end of the spectrum, for the more aggressive collection practices, certainly getting collections agencies involved is part of this. And one of the decisions that gets made is, who are we as Hospital X going to work with for our collections agency, and what's their reputation? And some providers seek out collections agencies that go out of their way to be intimidating, that write letters insinuating legal action, that actually take legal action, suing patients, garnishing wages and tax refunds, seizing assets, really going to the nth degree to make sure that if the patient that owes money has any net worth to their name, that it ends up going to this debt versus another one. And it's those kinds of practices that were the target of the recent executive order, because the federal government has a fair amount of power over any healthcare provider that takes federal money, which means Medicare. So there's some rules in place to prevent that now, but not everyone takes Medicare, and so it doesn't apply everywhere.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to talk about 3 organizations. These are not by any means the only 3 organizations out there doing this work, but there are 3 that I respect and have come across in my work and that are doing, I think, innovative and interesting things, specifically in the medical debt. The first is called $4, which I think is based out near you all in Oregon, although I'm not sure about that. And what they do is advocate on behalf of patients who have medical debt, taking advantage of some of the policies that hospitals are forced to have in place as a condition of their tax exempt status. Many, if not most, hospitals operate as nonprofit entities. And in order to operate as a nonprofit, you have to prove that you benefit the community. And one of the ways of doing that is by having a policy to assist people who have trouble paying medical bills. And these policies are often more generous than people think, going up to 400, 500, 600% of the federal poverty line and scaling up depending on how many people are in the household as dependents. And so what this organization does is make sure that patients are able to take advantage of any policies that might apply to them, either specific to the hospital or applying more broadly over a geographic area. So this is a resource, certainly for anyone who has medical debt to try to take advantage of, but also for people who are interested in this topic and want to dedicate some time to learning how to be an advocate. It's something that you can do virtually and involves reading up on some legalese and making a friendly call to the people working in the billing department to help resolve issues on behalf of patients who are in debt. The second organization is called RIP Medical Debt. And if you don't have time to volunteer with $4 or don't enjoy legalese, many churches, parishes, community groups have held fundraisers and given the money to RIP Medical Debt, who then uses it to buy up debt and forgive it. And they can do that for, as they say here, pennies on the dollar. So if you give RIP Medical Debt $1, they will be able to buy $100 worth of medical debt and forgive it forever. I actually have a project going with RIP Medical Debt at the moment to try to help them buy some of the debt that my company holds. Technically, it's our clients who hold it, but taking the legal right to collect that money away from us and give it to RIP Medical Debt, who promise, never to collect on it. And they do that at the price of 1 penny for $1. So it's a really very powerful opportunity to magnify the impact of financial resources to the benefit of people who need it, also with some incentive for the providers to cooperate. And if you're wondering why it's so low, that price, it's because for all the bad things about it, the market accurately prices this debt as very unlikely to be collected. And even if that's the case, all of the non-financial impacts that I highlighted earlier are still at play for this debt. So it's a very valuable and good thing for it to be bought and abolished. And then last, in terms of how this plays out, in our day-to-day lives, Emma and Bert and I were talking earlier. My wife and I were talking this morning. This topic comes up a lot in terms of how do I navigate the world of medical billing, of healthcare. And so there are some good ways to get educated, including some social media resources. I've highlighted Christy here, who's a registered nurse and has taken on patient advocacy as a mission. And she links to lots of other similar kinds of accounts on social media that help you learn how to be an advocate for yourself and for those around you. There's a book called Never Pay the First Bill that gets quoted a fair amount, and just approaches and kind of a toolkit for what next when you find yourself facing a large bill. For example, always ask for an itemized bill. You might find an error, and if nothing else, it buys you some time while they're trying to fulfill that request. And they say somehow magically the total of the itemized bill often ends up being lower than what you were told in the first place when they actually have to go and do the homework on it. So this is more of an informal, kind of educational set of resources, but I think it's good for making it practical in ways like I just described. So I think Bert and Emma will certainly circulate this for everyone's reference. I just kind of conclude my portion here by saying one of my favorite quotes, and the reason why I'm in healthcare in the first place, is the idea that a healthy person has 1,000 dreams, but a sick person can only have one. And I think that's why the experience of medicine and healthcare is set apart as special, and why it is such a travesty that the result so often is medical debt. And I'd like to see a world where that isn't the case. So I'd love to turn it back over to Bert and Emma to help us think through, what some of the applications might be for this group, and invite any other reflections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, maybe we could start, just with things that are on the top of anyone's mind to share or to ask. And then I know from, that brief conversation that Ryan alluded to, that there's a little bit more that I think it would be good for you to say, Ryan, just to what potential connection points. Not that we would be able to firm anything up now, of course, but, we see your community as wanting to engage mutually in the areas of life that matter the most. And, there's banking, we've talked a lot about banking, but for reasons that Ryan said, healthcare is that. And of course, it's related to debt. So, so maybe just initial thoughts. And then Ryan, if you would maybe guide us, to point us in the direction of some things we talked about earlier.
One thing you said that I wanted to just ask a second question. The group the RIP medical debt group, that the debt that's being bought up is debt that is not expected to be paid, that has a low rate of that. Is that true for a lot of medical debt, or just the ones that they're seeking out as they look for it? And how, is that something that, as we look at it as an overall scope, I mean, obviously, we talk about bankruptcies and stuff for medical debt. Is it because of the volume cost of it, that how big the amounts are, that it becomes something unpayable, or is it just because of those, are those who are finding themselves in that debt are tending to be those who would be unable to pay, or both, I guess? Is it different than other debt? Is it, we find it different than other debt as a result?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think what you said at the end is certainly a big part of it in terms of who tends to end up affected. So it's hard to say, but estimates are that of every dollar that gets billed to a patient in the healthcare system, only between 25 and 50 cents, so 25 to 50% of medical bills to patients are ultimately collected. So half or more than half of medical bills or of medical balances go unpaid. And so that contributes certainly to the high overall levels of medical debt. And I think it is a function of who it's happening to and some of the things that go along with needing medical services. But I think you can see that both ways. From the hospital standpoint, it's well, we know we're not going to get a lot of this, but by God, we're going to try to get all that we can. So it sort of heightens the anxiety or heightens the motivation on their side to go and collect it. And in many cases, this has gotten worse recently through COVID for various reasons, as you might imagine. But I think the value that's placed on debt financially, this is one of the things that actually got me more curious on the topic than I was to begin with. The value of the debt that's placed on it financially from the debt holder's standpoint is so low relative to the impact that it has on people's lives. The founder of RIP Medical Debt told me that one of the sort of mantras that he remembers every day, and I've remembered it too, is they will keep your bill on their kitchen. Sorry. They will keep your bill on their kitchen counter for years, always intending to pay it, feeling like there's something that they ought to be doing that they're not. And the power of being able to throw that bill away because no one wants you to pay it anymore is very powerful. And I think that kind of mismatch between the financial value and the emotional value is sad.
I think maybe I'll pick up on something on that last part of what you were saying, Ryan, to ask a question, which is that because it has that its value to the provider is 25 to 50% of what is billed. You were saying earlier in a private conversation how that's obviously a problem for them, and it incentivizes providers to not just work through insurance and this throwing huge prices at the wall and seeing what happens. So and it makes me wonder, okay, since there are providers, and I haven't done any research about this, but you said there are, who recognize that problem from a business perspective and maybe from a humanitarian one too. How does a community potentially work with, or how do we guide individuals and or help to have some sort of conduit with someone who would be willing to work with a group of individuals on a different basis, given just that fact that there is that huge incentive?
Yeah, it's a great point. And providers aren't blind to this by any means, and there is a certain amount of pain that they feel as well from the way that the system is dysfunctional. And so there is a growing community called direct care, or direct primary care, direct specialty care, physicians who don't do these inflated sticker prices. They have a sliding cash pay fee scale, for the kinds of things that Emma was mentioning earlier, as well as more complicated procedures. And I think there's certainly, all healthcare is local, and this is no exception. And so I think it would be an interesting path forward to research who in your community and all of our communities are starting to think this way and start to build a relationship between our faith communities and our networks and those providers, because the challenge they face is they're new and they need patient volume, and so they need people to recognize that they're not just a concierge medicine, alternative, cash oriented, very expensive kind of provider. They're actually trying to do something different. And so that makes it a natural fit from their end too, to pair with people who have the trust of patients and who are willing to try something new. So you could sort of imagine, an ongoing relationship with a network of providers like that, as well as a financial angle, perhaps to support those predictable, transparent, relatively low cash price providers.
And sorry, I'll try to frame another question for others here. Who is themselves, who among us here is in a situation where something like that could be beneficial to you? I mean, if you have, I have perfect health insurance, or my health insurance wouldn't allow, I wouldn't be able to benefit for something like that. And most people I know wouldn't be able to. Or is it more, okay, I could see for myself or for a proportion of people around me, that's worth pursuing. Or maybe to go back to that first slide, the 3 things that Ryan showed us, there's that more the advocacy part, like how to becoming more knowledgeable myself, or potentially becoming someone in the community who could help others in this community or in your other communities. So if those are like 2 angles here, love to hear what is either one of those really speaking to you, and how.
I would say that sort of thing, certainly would. It would benefit me as someone who's recently taken on a lot more medical debt than I would have expected. And also, like, I was just coming out of, or my family's just coming out of an experience where my dad was diagnosed with cancer in the middle of the pandemic, at a time where, there's already a sense of stress about your job. So now he's, going through a really rigorous chemo treatment, and feels in the middle of a pandemic, and is feeling pressure that he has to go in person to the office, risk getting COVID in order to keep his job. And it's not, and he loves his job, it wasn't that, but it was also that he knows that if he loses his health insurance in the middle of cancer treatment, like, he's screwed. And so there's a sense of like that, of like the level of psychological stress that, was on my family at that time. You imagine how that could have been. Yeah, how that's paired with the fact that the best doctor to see wasn't even in network for his insurance company, and so there's just all of this mess and just like layers of stress that come with a diagnosis where just getting better should be your primary focus. And so you imagine something like what you're talking about, Brian, where there's a network of providers, where there's some sense of like there's goodwill here in a way that you never have with an insurance company, whether it's car insurance or health insurance. It's just there's never a sense of like, oh, I feel like this person, has my back, in the way you might feel about your doctor, for example, but they're kind of powerless, or it seems like they might be powerless to act within this larger framework where prices, like, as you mentioned, are already so inflated, or there's incentives to keep prices high for insurance companies. Yes, I just imagine that sense of even just, goodwill on behalf of the person that you're working with, on behalf of the person who's doing that billing, would make a huge difference in that sort of situation.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to highlight that experience of being able to care for patients is something that's been increasingly taken away from physicians and healthcare providers over the last 100 years, from their perspective. And in some ways, this represents a return to an old model, or a return to what the profession wants to be for itself. Not without its risks, certainly, but possibly more in keeping with how a lot of doctors want to be.
Here's someone who hasn't piped up in a while. Any thoughts at this point?
This is David. I can think of 2 areas that one's easier for me to investigate. I know my wife has been interested in, there's a collection of doctors in Southeast Portland that were talking about making a explicitly Catholic community, whatever you call it, group of doctors. And I'm curious whether they have practice, that's the word I was after. I'm curious whether they have thought about this. So I will definitely ask her to sort of feel them out and see if this is something they're thinking of. The other group that I think of is my adult son who's living in Corvallis. It's a kind of rural Oregon with a bunch of young people all in one house. Many of them are college students. And when they all had COVID, one of them developed a rare and quite frightening COVID symptom. And they were trying to obtain information through a lot of insurance companies have these free, you can call in or do video calls, sort of ask a nurse lines. And they found that that was totally dysfunctional. But what I thought about from this discussion is, you know, it never occurred to them to just go to the doctor. Like that was never, either these ask a nurse lines were going to work or she was just going to tough it out. So it would be interesting to know, like, what is their situation? Are they unwilling to seek medical help because of the fear of the cost? Or are there other reasons?
Maybe one more person with some thoughts before we wrap up.
Those doctors that you talked about who are trying to get back to the system of just you go to the doctor, you don't pay insurance, you just pay a bill that they think is reasonable, and but they can only do that for kind of small normal things. I mean, they couldn't, if they had to buy an MRI or some other huge machine, they would have to bill you accordingly. So would that kind of system be able to take off these days when so much of medicine depends on these really high tech tests and machines and all?
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's certainly limitations to it. You run up against some practical realities about the equipment that's needed to practice modern medicine. That being said, there's more already than you might imagine. For example, a knee replacement at a outpatient surgery center for a Medicare patient brings in about $2,000 to the facility on average using insurance, portions of which have to go to, the overhead, the cost of collecting the bill, and lots of other like financial costs. There is a group of orthopedic surgeons in California that says, hey, I might have gotten $2,000 before, but I wasn't seeing all of that. I was seeing maybe 1,000. And I want to have a simpler practice. So I'm going to charge, $750 or even $500 for that procedure. And for someone who's got a $500 deductible or the kind of health plan that could have them on the hook for up to, the whole $2,000 bill or possibly more, even some of those more complex procedures start to make a little bit more sense as long as the direct groups are able to rent time from a facility or rent time from a MRI machine, which those people are generally pretty willing to do because their economics are driven on utilization and trying to get the most for their capital investment. So there's certainly limitations, but I think there's reason to hope it could be for more acute issues too.
Thanks. That's good perspective. Well, I think we should let's just go over a few wrap up points here. Yeah, for one, sorry, the way this kind of broke down for me that was that things having to do with that first of the three things you mentioned, and then things more on that we were just asking about there. So it seems that these are things that would be, I think it would be really good for our community to have an ongoing conversation. So certainly through email, if you would like to share anything. Ryan, are you? Yeah, I think you said that you implied this, but yeah, could people contact you? You know, who wanted to? Yeah, if you wanted to talk through something, either whether it's personal or just like I also have a
Absolutely.
tremendous interest in this. So that's great. I think that in a sense we're seeing a model of one of the potentials for this community is like Ryan's a professional in this area, even though he's just gaining the expertise in the exact thing we're talking about. So you know so he's offering that to us because a lot of this, as he's saying, has to do with leveraging knowledge that most of us don't have. So yeah, so that's the thing right there. I think we'll make sure that this talk is available, to share, and also the resources that Ryan talked about, and we'll make sure that's broken out in a way that's helpful, and create like a resources page. This is a good impetus to have like a resources page on where this is on the internet, or other sort of community and economy stuff.
Yeah. And I think along those lines too, I know a lot of us here are in the Portland area, but I know some of the folks who will be watching this recording are in South Bend. I think especially as people also find providers that, like I know you were mentioning, David, like this Catholic network, seeing, and you're curious about what their billing practices are. But as people find providers that maybe are adopting this direct care model that kind of are kind of trying to push against this sort of system, would love to even just circulate that sort of resource, because it's obviously, I know I use my insurance company to find providers, so I wouldn't even know to find someone else, and in fact probably previously thought there was something stingy about not taking insurance and not thinking about the flip side of that, which like that is a possible benefit. So would love to also just share that sort of thing.
Yeah. And then so before, like, one other last piece, is there anything else that that anyone is hoping to share, or hoping is shared out of this, or a way of sharing information and hopes coming out of this talk that hasn't been mentioned? Okay, well, if anything comes up, please share it. And so the update, the changing feet here that we were talking about is we don't need to belabor it. It's pretty simple. The South Bend, the Holy Cross Parish in South Bend, in the near Northwest neighborhood, they were the biggest obstacle for them in going forward with this initiative, and the banking with NDFCU was diocesan approval. And so a bunch of diocesan officials talked about it, and then it got explicit sign off from the bishop, who thought this is great. And so now we're there. And it'll be a couple of months of like lead up of forming the committee there, and yeah, doing back work. And for us, one thing that this will do is make a bit more explicit something of like things that we're together now being resting differently. And that is like, well, Simone Bay House, usual community, there's people who can gather here and have potlucks, and that'll be one thing. And so we'll talk about our loans like in that context. And then there's this context, which anyone can join from, let's say a community here, a community in South Bend, and individuals. And then we'll talk more about these, shared learning and resources that have applicability in different communities that could inspire practices that we could then share and develop at this level, but try to figure out how they would work locally.
Yeah. And so should I talk about next month?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so our meeting next month, we realized that the first Monday is July 4th. So we're going to push back our first Monday meeting to July 11th. We'll have another guest, Lucas Briola, who's a professor of theology, who will be talking to us about like the intersection between this community and economy vision and Laudato Si, and care for the environment. So that'll be the focus of next month's conversation. And I know he also has some really great practical examples of communities trying to live this out, the kind of Eucharistic vision of Laudato Si, and how to connect liturgy and care for creation. So we're really excited to talk about that with you all next month, and hopefully generating some more of these really concrete practices. and ways of getting engaged that we could adopt as communities. So.
Yeah, which I love, because like Kathy, we had a great, I think there's a lot of energy for this, these being tied at Holy Redeemer.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Thanks for being with us for all this time. Thank you, Ryan, for that great presentation. Really appreciate
Thank
that.
you, Ryan.
Yeah, all the energy put into that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, peace be with you.
Take
Good
care.
night, everybody.
Bye, guys.